Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe and share. The story begins not in blood, nor in fire, but in silence. Millbrook, Virginia, early in the 19th century, appeared to outsiders as a modest and orderly community. Its lanes were lined with chestnut trees, its parish maintained with proud punctuality, and its families bound by the usual proprieties of trade, worship, and reputation. Yet beneath this hushed facade, whispers lingered around one particular household, the farmhouse of the Sullivan family. The Sullivans were not recent arrivals. Their name was inscribed in old parish rolls and tax ledgers. A family as fixed in the soil as the gravestones that bore it. Yet Ezra Sullivan, the patriarch in those years, commanded an unease that exceeded the ordinary respect due to his standing. His presence was heavy, his gait deliberate, his eyes watchful. Constance, sometimes written as Constant in ledgers, as though even the clerks hesitated to record her name with certainty, managed both household and trade with a meticulousness that bordered on severity. Their farm was said to provide shelter for the displaced, but the displaced never returned to tell what sort of shelter it was. Neighbors, though wary, noticed the details. The children that came into the Sullivan home did not resemble one another, nor carry the likeness of kin. They arrived at odd hours, conveyed in carts under tarpaulin. Some bore bruises, others looked gaunt, all seemed subdued. Within weeks or months, they would vanish. Constance explained away their disappearances with a tone of weary charity, placed in good homes, adopted in towns beyond your knowing, yet the numbers strained credulity. By the mid-1820s, entries in the parish register showed dozens of orphans baptized, with no subsequent trace in marriage rolls, death lists, or migration records. The unease grew sharper with the reports of sounds. Farmhands recalled cries muffled behind cellar doors. Travelers on the Millbrook Road spoke of children's voices that rose and fell with the wind. William Hutchinson, a neighbor whose field abutted the Sullivan property, testified years later that he had heard weeping that no storm could disguise. It was this detail, insistent, gnawing, that would set events in motion. At first, the townspeople convinced themselves to dismiss what they suspected. It was not uncommon for poorer families to take in strays, to put children to work, to trade apprenticeships that looked little different from bondage. In such a world, hardship was a language all understood. Yet Millbrook's silence, a silence cultivated by Ezra's grim reputation, was something different. It was not merely poverty, but concealment. The records that survive today, preserved in county folios, stamped property of the Commonwealth, and marred by redactions, hint at the community's complicity. Deputations were drafted and then withdrawn. Complaints half-written were burned in hearths before signatures could be fixed. As one marginal note in Sheriff Benjamin Crawford's logbook reads, in faded ink, they feared him more than the truth. It was Crawford, eventually, who resolved to breach that silence. By temperament he was not an innovator, not a man prone to suspicion beyond necessity, yet he trusted the plain speech of his townsfolk. In 1834, when Hutchinson came to him with trembling insistence that no Christian ears could ignore what was heard, Crawford allowed himself to be persuaded. He began to keep night watch near the Sullivan farm, and within days he too heard the cries. They were not the cries of play, nor of ordinary discipline. They were sharp, abrupt, broken by what sounded like chains. This was the point of no return. Crawford assembled a small party, Deputy Webb, William Hutchinson himself, and two other men whose names have been lost to the records. They arrived at the farmstead in late spring, approaching under a moon that seemed reluctant to shine. Ezra, confronted at his door, resisted their entry, citing rights of property, but the law was not entirely on his side. An affidavit had been sworn, a warrant obtained, and so by lantern light the basement door was forced. What they found there has remained a subject of dread even in the most restrained county accounts. 47 children, chained by wrist and ankle, lay upon straw darkened with filth. The smell of ether and of unwashed wounds filled the air. Instruments, iron forceps, surgical saws, Calipers for measuring skulls were arranged on a table, each stained with the memory of use. Ledgers stacked in corners recorded dates, names half erased and strange annotations in Constance's hand. Conditioning complete. Resale arranged, unsuitable. Discard. In the far recess of the cellar, a boy lay motionless, his body bearing signs of incision and suturing. Whether he was alive or gone at the time of discovery remains uncertain. The testimonies differ, and official papers redact the detail. The lanterns flickered. One child, later identified as Rebecca, whispered through her cracked lips, "He said no one would ever find us." The discovery spread through Millbrook with the force of revelation. Neighbors who had long ignored their instincts now found themselves compelled to reckon with them. The Sullivan farm, once a symbol of uneasy respect, became the epicenter of outrage and fear. What had been concealed was now undeniable. The silence had been broken, and in its place a dreadful clarity. Evil had flourished among them, nurtured by their own unwillingness to see. "You've crossed the threshold with us once more. If the silence of Millbrook unsettled you, wait until you hear the voices that refuse to be silenced. If you're drawn to these buried histories, subscribe, share this story, and keep watch with us." The basement discovery did not end the Sullivan terror. It merely shifted it into the open, where denial was no longer possible. The children, 47 souls reclaimed from that cellar, became both living evidence and living reminders of what had been endured. Their presence alone unsettled the community more than any report. The sight of them, gaunt and shivering under borrowed blankets, left even the hardest men unable to meet one another's gaze. Most were too weak to speak. Weeks of confinement had stripped them of voice and motion. Some recoiled at the touch of light as though daylight itself were an enemy. But a handful found strength enough to answer when Sheriff Crawford and the town physician Dr. Samuel Graves attempted to gather testimony. Of those voices, two would come to define the case: Rebecca and Timothy. Rebecca was perhaps 11, though her precise age was uncertain. She herself did not know. Her hair was matted, her arms scarred with thin cuts, as though someone had used her skin for practice. She whispered at first, refusing to meet anyone's eyes until the sheriff gently pressed her hand in his, and said, "Child, you are safe." Then, like a gate creaking open, the words began to emerge. She spoke of Constance's endless measurements: height, weight, the circumference of her skull. She spoke of bitter tonics forced down her throat, of ink pressed into her skin in symbols she could not read. She spoke of other children taken upstairs, never to return. Each time she faltered, she asked one question: "Will he hear?" Sheriff Crawford answered with steady insistence, "Not anymore." But even he was not certain of the truth. Timothy, older, perhaps 15, was less afraid, though his anger burned through his frailty. His account was not whispered but spat as if each word were a weapon. He described Ezra's commands, the way he would force them into rows, compel them to recite verses not from scripture but from strange pamphlets, filled with diagrams of the human form. Timothy said he was beaten not for disobedience, but for hesitation. "He told us we were instruments," the boy said, "and that an instrument has no will of its own." The town listened in horrified silence as these fragments emerged. The courthouse, usually reserved for property disputes and petty thefts, now hosted testimony that froze the marrow. People who had prided themselves on their godliness found themselves muttering prayers in trembling voices, yet not all welcomed the truth. Among Millbrook's wealthier residents, there were whispers that the Sullivans had merely been excessively strict, that talk of chains and experiments was exaggerated by frightened children. Ezra had business ties after all, and Constance's reputation for efficiency had long benefited the town's trade. To admit full belief in the children's words was to admit one's own blindness, one's own complicity. Some found that admission too costly. The division cut through Millbrook like a knife. At the tavern, arguments turned violent. Men accused neighbors of cowardice. Women wept into their hands. Church elders insisted that judgment must be measured, not hasty. The Sullivans themselves, Ezra grim and silent, Constance with her veil drawn low, sat in the county jail awaiting trial. They offered no defense, no protest, only silence. In that silence, some townsfolk heard guilt, others, dignity. Meanwhile, the rescued children were housed in the parish hall, transformed overnight into a place of refuge, but the hall itself seemed cursed by their presence. At night, townsfolk passing by swore they heard cries echoing from within, though the doors were shut. Some claimed the children slept with eyes open, whispering in languages not their own.
Dr. Graves dismissed such tales as the symptoms of trauma, yet he admitted in private notes, still preserved in the archives, that several children displayed peculiarities of memory, recalling events in towns and plantations they had never visited, or speaking the names of people long dead. Rebecca in particular became a figure of fascination. Her testimony, delivered before the county magistrates, carried a conviction that belied her youth. When asked why she had survived when so many others had vanished, she answered only, "Because I remembered." Pressed to explain what she meant, she grew silent, trembling. Timothy's words were less cryptic, more damn. "He told us we were to be sent on," he declared, his voice echoing in the chamber. "He said there were men who would pay. He said our bones and our blood were worth more than our lives." That single statement transformed the proceeding. It was no longer merely a case of cruelty within one family. It was evidence of commerce, of a network. The Sullivans were not alone. Sheriff Crawford understood the weight of this revelation. The law in 1830s Virginia was ill-equipped for conspiracies that crossed county lines. But Crawford, driven by something deeper than duty, began to investigate beyond Millbrook. He followed ledgers found in the Sullivan basement, tracing initials and cryptic addresses. What he uncovered hinted at buyers in Richmond, correspondences with men in Maryland, even connections to plantations where supplies had been requested under the guise of labor. The truth was vast, and it was monstrous. Rebecca and Timothy's testimonies became the anchor of the case, but also its curse, for while they shed light on the Sullivans' crimes, they also exposed a darkness far greater than one family's cruelty. Millbrook stood at the threshold of realization. Their town had not harbored an isolated evil. It had been a gateway, and though Ezra and Constance now sat behind iron bars, there was a growing sense that the true danger remained outside, unbound, waiting. If you thought Millbrook's horrors were the worst, brace yourself. The darkness stretches far beyond a single basement. Share this story, hit like, and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The Sullivan case was only the first thread in a web of unimaginable cruelty. While Millbrook wrestled with the immediate horrors, Sheriff Crawford's investigation, guided by Rebecca and Timothy's detailed accounts, began revealing connections that led deep into the southern state. It was a network of exploitation, trafficking, and murder that had operated largely unseen, protected by wealth, power, and the complacency of a society eager to believe in its own morality. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when Crawford received testimony from a man named James Pierce, a former clerk for Henry Blackwood, a wealthy plantation owner in South Carolina. Pierce's words were precise, calm, and terrifying. He spoke of children shipped from orphanages and poorhouses, carefully selected for their age, obedience, and aptitude, and delivered to plantations where they were used for labor experimentation or work. Pierce described how Blackwood held a gathering in the fall of 1833, a demonstration meant for potential buyers. The event was likened to a livestock auction, only the stock were children. Visitors from across the South were encouraged to inspect the children, to prod their responses to punishment, and to evaluate their physical and intellectual capacity. The children were forced to perform tasks, endure tests of endurance, and even show their reactions to poisons and diseases, all under the guise of scientific observation. Pierce's account made members of the grand jury physically record. The images of children being measured, prodded, and catalogued for sale were so extreme that several jurors left the courtroom, unable to bear the weight of what had been described. The organized nature of the network was staggering. It was not a few rogue actors, but a systematic, business-like operation involving buyers, sellers, and even medical professionals. Financial records revealed a grim calculus. Younger children, easier to control and condition, commanded higher prices. Children with specific traits, strength, agility, intelligence, were sold at a premium. The scale of profits shocked even seasoned investigators. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in the 1830s, a fortune that underlined the value of human life reduced to commerce. Crawford's raids, coordinated across multiple states, liberated over 100 additional children. Warehouses, plantations, and hidden chambers were discovered, each bearing the mark of organized cruelty. The evidence ledgers, correspondences, and meticulous logs painted a portrait of meticulous evil. Prominent figures were implicated: Blackwood, 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, and even a state legislator from Georgia, known as a major purchaser. Some faced prosecution, others escaped through political influence or technicality. Yet the exposure of the network ignited national outrage. Newspapers documented the operations in unprecedented detail, forcing a societal reckoning with the exploitation of the most vulnerable. The surviving children required extensive medical treatment, therapy, and patient rehabilitation were only the first steps in addressing years of abuse. Some, like Rebecca, eventually rebuilt their lives, though scars, physical, psychological, and emotional, remained permanent. Others struggled, lost, or succumbed to the lingering effects of trauma. The broader implications were profound. The Sullivan case, followed closely by the exposure of Blackwood's network, led to federal legislation addressing child trafficking, the first comprehensive child protection laws in Virginia, and reforms in the oversight of orphanages and poor housing. Communities were forced to confront complicity, to question assumptions about respectability, and to recognize the need for vigilance in protecting children. Blackwood's plantation, once a place of calculated cruelty, became a symbol of systemic evil. Though he died in prison, his name endured in the annals of horror, a warning of the lengths to which human greed and ambition could corrupt morality. The physicians involved were expelled and imprisoned, spurring new regulations governing medical research and ethical treatment of subjects. For Millbrook and the surrounding communities, the revelations were transformative. Ordinary citizens, William Hutchinson, Sheriff Crawford, and the courageous children themselves, had been the instruments of discovery. Their courage and refusal to ignore the truth exposed not only one family's crimes, but a network that stretched across state lines, revealing how ordinary people could either enable or confront evil. Even after legal actions concluded, the shadow of the network lingered. Letters and correspondences, preserved in evidence, continued to uncover additional operations for years, reminding investigators that the machinery of exploitation extended beyond any single case. It was a network of shadows, sustained by societal complacency, wealth, and sight, and at the center of it all remained the children, their suffering, their courage, and the voices that refused to remain silent. Rebecca, Timothy, and the others became both witnesses and symbols of innocence violated, of resilience, and of the necessity for moral courage in the face of unimaginable darkness. The horrors we've uncovered are only a fraction of what lurked behind closed doors in America's past. If this story unsettled you, share it with someone who appreciates history's dark truths. Subscribe and join us as we continue unearthing the secrets, one chilling tale at a time. The network had been exposed, the horrors laid bare, but would justice be served? Hit like, share this story, and subscribe, because the tale only deepens from here. The trials following the raids were some of the most sensational in American history. Courtrooms across multiple states were packed with jurors, spectators, and journalists, all eager to witness the reckoning for crimes that had long hidden in plain sight. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed financial records, correspondences, and the testimonies of surviving children painted an unflinching portrait of systematic abuse, trafficking, and murder. Ezra Sullivan, captured during the initial raid, was tried first. The courtroom was tense as witnesses described the basement where 47 children had been held in chains. Medical records documented injuries, infections, and the results of cruel experiments. Sullivan was convicted of multiple charges, including kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. On November 15, 1836, he was executed by hanging in Richmond before a crowd of over 3,000. His final words, a mixture of confession and plea for forgiveness, shocked the nation and confirmed the depth of his depravity. Henry Blackwood's trial became the focal point of national attention. His plantation had been a hub for trafficking and horrific experiments. Medical records seized from his estate revealed children deliberately infected with diseases, subjected to poisons, and operated on without anesthesia. Blackwood was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but appeals and political maneuvering delayed his execution. He eventually died in prison in 1841, officially from a heart attack, though rumors of foul play circulated, suggesting associates feared he might reveal more secrets.
The two physicians from Charleston Medical College faced expulsion and long prison sentences. Their participation in the experiments triggered sweeping reforms in medical ethics and regulations governing human subjects. The scandal nearly closed the college, and several faculty members were scrutinized for turning a blind eye. Despite the breadth of evidence, some powerful figures escaped justice. Wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe, while others leveraged political connections to avoid prosecution or receive minimal penalties. A Georgia state legislator, a major buyer within the network, was censured but never criminally charged. These failures highlighted the limitations of the legal system when confronting entrenched wealth and power. Public reaction was a mixture of horror and moral reckoning. Newspapers covered the trials with unprecedented detail, dedicating entire issues to the findings. Communities were forced to confront the complicity and oversight failures that had allowed such a network to operate for decades. Millbrook residents wrestled with guilt. How had they missed the signs for 20 years? How many opportunities had been ignored, and could earlier vigilance have prevented some of the suffering? The surviving children faced long, difficult recoveries. Many required extensive medical and psychological care. For some, like Rebecca, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. She was placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, where she found safety, stability, and eventually a life of her own. Others carried physical and emotional scars indefinitely, struggling with trauma, mental illness, and addiction. The legal and societal outcomes of the Sullivan and Blackwood cases extended far beyond the courtroom. Virginia passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, establishing government oversight of orphanages and requiring background checks for those caring for large numbers of children. Other states quickly followed, creating a foundation for modern child welfare system. Federal laws were also strengthened to address interstate trafficking and crimes against children, granting marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute such networks. Individuals inspired by the case dedicated their lives to reform. Marcus Whitfield, previously manipulated into enabling the Sullivan operation, established free clinics for orphaned and abandoned children and became a leading advocate for ethical medical practice. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, promoted to federal marshal, specialized in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques that set precedents for decades. Perhaps most importantly, the case shifted public consciousness. The romantic notion of charitable caretakers was replaced by a realistic understanding of the need for oversight, vigilance, and legal protections. The phrase "another Sullivan case" entered public lexicon as a warning of potential abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Even decades later, the letters, ledgers, and testimonies preserved from the raids continued to reveal further operations, ensuring that the memory of the network and the lessons learned remained alive. The story of Millbrook and Blackwood's plantations became a cautionary tale. Evil often wears the mask of respectability, and moral courage, however small, can expose even the most entrenched systems of exploitation. The trials were over, but the echoes of the Sullivan and Blackwood networks would resonate for generations. If this story chilled you, share it with someone who loves dark history. Subscribe for more and join us as we continue uncovering the secrets hidden in America's past. The trials ended, the perpetrators punished or in some cases escaped, but the story didn't end there. The echoes of the Sullivan and Blackwood network would shape generations. The Sullivan case left an indelible mark on American society, both legally and culturally. Its exposure forced lawmakers, reformers, and communities to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerability of children and the inadequacy of existing oversight. Virginia's comprehensive child protection laws became a model for other states, establishing government oversight of orphanages, stricter adoption procedures, and mandatory background checks for caregivers. Federal statutes strengthened law enforcement's ability to prosecute interstate trafficking, setting the groundwork for modern anti-trafficking legislation. Survivors of the network faced lifelong challenges. 47 children had been rescued from the Sullivan basement, many after years of captivity and abuse. Some, like Rebecca, found safety and stability with supportive family. She lived to 73, marrying and raising her own family, but she never spoke publicly about her experiences again, choosing privacy and quiet healing over notoriety. Other survivors struggled with trauma, mental illness, addiction, and physical disabilities, carrying the marks of their abuse for the rest of their lives. Some never fully recovered, passing away young due to complications stemming from their mistreatment. Despite the suffering, the stories of resilience and courage became central to the Sullivan legacy. Ordinary individuals like William Hutchinson, who reported suspicious activities, and Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who acted on community concerns, demonstrated the power of moral courage to confront systemic evil. These acts were reminders that vigilance, conscience, and compassion are often the first lines of defense against abuse. The physical remnants of the network, the Sullivan plantation, the Blackwood estate, were either demolished or sealed. The Sullivan basement, where 47 children had been held,
was filled with concrete and a small cemetery was established to memorialize the victims. Though most names were lost to history, the sites became symbols of collective remembrance and the societal obligation to protect the most vulnerable. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers continued to study the detailed documentation of the case. Letters, ledgers, financial records, and testimonies. The Sullivan case became a benchmark for understanding the interplay of wealth, power, corruption, and systemic exploitation. Its lessons resonated in the legal reforms, social welfare policies, and ethical standards that followed. The case also sparked discussions about community responsibility. Millbrook residents grappled with guilt for not noticing the signs for 2 decades. Their story served as a cautionary tale. Moral responsibility extends beyond the law. A community's willingness to question appearances and investigate anomalies can prevent atrocities. Even more broadly, the Sullivan case changed the narrative of child welfare in America. The idealized view of benevolent orphanages and charitable caretakers gave way to a more pragmatic understanding. Vulnerable children required oversight, systemic protections, and legal safeguards. Another Sullivan case became a phrase invoked to warn against complacency and to remind society that evil can hide behind respectable facades. In the end, the Sullivan and Blackwood networks were stopped not by a single heroic act, but by the combination of many ordinary citizens, brave survivors, dedicated law enforcement, and committed reformers. Their collective courage illuminated the darkness, exposing one of the most horrific chapters in American history. If this story gave you chills, remember that history's darkest chapters often teach the brightest lessons about courage, vigilance, and compassion. Share this tale with someone who appreciates dark mysteries. Subscribe for more, and join us as we continue to uncover the hidden horrors and hidden heroes in America's past. The echoes of the Sullivan case remind us, evil may hide behind a mask of respectability, but conscience, courage, and action can always expose it. Even after justice was served, the shadows of the Sullivan and Blackwood networks lingered, lessons etched into the fabric of society. The Sullivan case remained a landmark in American history, not only for the crimes committed, but for the systemic changes it inspired. The exposure of such a vast, well-organized child trafficking network revealed the failures of local oversight, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the capacity for evil to masquerade as benevolent. Communities, lawmakers, and law enforcement realized that vigilance, transparency, and accountability were essential to prevent future atrocities. The survivors' experiences became central to understanding the long-term effects of trauma. Psychologists and social reformers documented the profound psychological, emotional, and physical consequences of prolonged captivity, abuse, and neglect. Many children struggled to rebuild trust, form relationships, and integrate into society, yet their resilience also became a testament to human endurance. Rebecca's courage to testify, even after years of imprisonment, symbolized the power of hope and moral strength in confronting evil. The Sullivan investigation's legacy influenced the development of modern child protection systems. Background checks, adoption regulations, and government oversight became standard, ensuring that orphanages and child care institutions could not operate without scrutiny. Federal intervention in cross-state crimes grew more structured, establishing precedents for tackling organized criminal enterprises that operated beyond local jurisdictions. The case also underscored the role of individual conscience and community responsibility. Ordinary citizens, whether a whistleblower, a concerned neighbor, or a brave survivor, were shown to be capable of extraordinary impact. Their actions demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming corruption and systemic evil, moral courage could make a difference. Beyond law and reform, the Sullivan and Blackwood story entered American cultural consciousness as a warning. Evil can hide behind ordinary appearances. The phrase "another Sullivan case" became shorthand for vigilance against exploitation, manipulation, and abuse. Educators, historians, and storytellers used the case to emphasize critical thinking, ethical responsibility, and awareness of the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations. The physical legacy of the case, the sealed basement, the demolished plantation, and the memorial cemetery, served as somber reminders of the lives lost and the importance of remembrance. These sites encouraged reflection on the societal duty to protect children and vulnerable individuals from harm. The Sullivan case teaches that evil is rarely obvious, and vigilance, courage, and compassion are the forces that can expose it. Share this story to remember the victims, reflect on history, and learn the lessons it imparts. Stay vigilant, stay curious, And never underestimate the power of conscience to confront even the darkest human deed. The horrors of the Sullivan and Blackwood networks did more than shock a nation. They reshaped how America would understand, protect and value its children. The Sullivan case left an indelible mark on American society. Newspapers, pamphlets and books recounted the atrocities, exposing the dark reality that exploitation could hide behind the facade of charity and respectability. The public reaction was a mix of horror, outrage and reflection. Families who had once unquestioningly trusted local institutions began demanding transparency, oversight and accountability. Historians later described the case as a turning point in American social consciousness. It demonstrated that even in rural, seemingly moral communities, systemic abuse could persist when human greed, deception and complicity went unchecked. Scholars used the Sullivan investigation as a case study in psychology, criminology and law enforcement, examining how authority, fear and manipulation could maintain such a network for decades. The case influenced legal reforms far beyond Virginia. The federal government, realizing that state laws were insufficient to address cross-border trafficking, enacted statutes giving marshals broader authority to investigate and prosecute interstate crimes. States implemented stricter regulations for orphanages, poorhouses and adoption procedures. Background checks, medical oversight and mandatory reporting became critical tools in child protection. These changes formed the foundation of modern child welfare systems in the United States. In literature and media, the Sullivan case became a cautionary tale. Stories and accounts emphasized moral vigilance, community responsibility, and the potential for evil to wear a mask of normalcy. Teachers and reformers cited the case when advocating for ethical education and the protection of vulnerable children. The narrative of the surviving children, particularly Rebecca, highlighted resilience and the transformative power of courage, even in the darkest circumstance. Culturally, the case prompted discussions about the ethics of institutions, the dangers of blind trust and the responsibility of citizens to intervene. It became a benchmark against which later cases of child exploitation were measured. The phrase "another Sullivan" entered common usage in newspapers and legal discussions as shorthand for systemic abuse and a failure to safeguard the vulnerable. Even decades later, the Sullivan and Blackwood networks were referenced in legal, historical and psychological study. Law enforcement professionals studied the case to understand criminal networks, human trafficking, and psychological manipulation. Psychologists and social workers examined the survivors' experiences to refine trauma-informed care practices. The lessons extended far beyond the courtroom, shaping the ethos of child welfare, social responsibility, and community vigilance. The Sullivan case reminds us that history is not just a record of events, but a teacher of vigilance, ethics, and courage. Share this story, reflect on its lessons, and honor the resilience of those who survived, because understanding the past is the first step toward protecting the future. Even over a century later, the shadows of the Sullivan and Blackwood operations linger, reminding us that vigilance is eternal and justice is often fragile. The Sullivan case did more than inspire legal reforms. It reshaped the collective consciousness about the vulnerability of children and the responsibilities of society. For the survivors, life after captivity was a complex mixture of healing, resilience, and for many, enduring trauma. Some found stability and love in new families, like Rebecca, who lived a long life marked by quiet dignity. Others struggled with nightmares, mistrust and health problems caused by years of neglect and abuse. The case exposed the limitations of both local and national authority. While some perpetrators were brought to justice, others escaped punishment due to wealth, influence, or death. This highlighted a sobering reality. Legal systems can only go so far without public awareness, vigilance, and moral courage. The ordinary citizens who spoke out, reported suspicious activities, and supported survivors became the unsung heroes of the case. Their actions demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming evil, individuals could effect meaningful change. The Sullivan farm, demolished and sealed, became a somber symbol. Its memory served as a reminder of the depths of human depravity and the consequences of societal neglect. The small cemetery established on the property honored the children who died, a physical testament to lives lost and a need to never forget. Memorials and historical studies ensured that future generations could learn from the tragedy, understanding both the horror and the lessons it offered. Legally and socially, the Sullivan case set important precedents. Federal marshals expanded authority, interstate cooperation, and stricter child welfare regulations became cornerstones in the fight against child trafficking. The case helped establish investigative techniques, trauma-informed care practices, and ethical standards in social services and medical oversight. Scholars often cite the Sullivan investigation as an early, influential example of systematic social reform catalyzed by exposing human rights violations. Culturally, the story of the Sullivan Network reinforced the importance of skepticism, vigilance, and moral responsibility. It became a cautionary tale, illustrating that appearances are deceptive, that evil can masquerade as virtue, and that silence allows atrocities to flourish. Educators, reformers, and historians emphasized these lessons when discussing community ethics, child protection, and the moral imperative to act against injustice. Closing reflection: the legacy of the Sullivan case endures not just in laws or historical records, but in the understanding that courage, vigilance, and compassion can confront even the most entrenched evil. The echoes of the children's suffering remind us that protecting the vulnerable is not optional, it is a moral duty, and while history cannot undo the horrors they endured, remembering, educating, and acting ensures that their suffering informs a safer future for generations to come. If this story moved you, share it, reflect on its lessons, and honor the survivors. The darkness of the past has many stories, and by uncovering them, we learn how to protect the light of the future. Even as decades pass, the echoes of the Sullivan case remind us that evil often hides behind the masks of respectability, and vigilance is never optional. The Sullivan and Blackwood operations were not just crimes of their time, they were warnings etched into history. They revealed how systemic neglect, greed, and corruption can converge to exploit the most vulnerable. The legal reforms that followed were crucial, but the real lesson lay in human responsibility. Ordinary people who chose to act, like William Hutchinson reporting suspicious activity, Sheriff Crawford pursuing the truth, and Rebecca bravely testifying, demonstrated that moral courage could disrupt even deeply entrenched evil. Survivors' stories continued to resonate. While some, like Rebecca, built new lives with love and care, many struggled with lasting trauma. Their experiences highlighted the need for societal support systems, psychological care, and sustained vigilance against abuse. It became clear that protecting children is not solely the responsibility of the law. It is a collective duty requiring awareness, courage, and compassion. The Sullivan Farm's demolition, and the sealing of its basement, symbolized society's attempt to contain the memory of horror. Yet the small cemetery honoring the deceased children served as a permanent reminder that society must never forget the cost of inaction. Schools, historians, and reformers preserved the story, ensuring that lessons from the past informed policies and practices in child protection, social welfare, and ethical oversight. Legally, the Sullivan case laid the foundation for modern child welfare laws, interstate enforcement against trafficking, and trauma-informed approaches in investigations. It also exposed the importance of federal oversight in crimes that cross state lines. Socially, the case reinforced that evil often thrives in silence and secrecy, and that communities must be vigilant, skeptical of appearances, and willing to act. Closing reflection: the legacy of the Sullivan case is a dual lesson. It warns of the depths of human cruelty and celebrates the power of conscience and courage. By remembering the victims, supporting survivors, and teaching the importance of vigilance, we ensure that the darkness of the past shapes a safer, more compassionate future. If this story moved you, share it, reflect on its lessons, and honor the courage of those who resisted the darkness. History has many secrets, but by uncovering them, we can protect the light of tomorrow. Even over a century later, the shadows of the Sullivan case linger, reminding us that evil can flourish in the quietest corners, and that courage, even in the smallest acts, can topple it. The Sullivan case, along with the Blackwood Network, became more than a sensational story. It became a benchmark in American history for understanding systemic abuse, exploitation, and the consequences of ignoring moral warning signs. Communities realized that blind trust in appearances could conceal monstrous realities, and the narrative of the benevolent caregiver was forever altered in public consciousness. For the surviving children, life after rescue was a complex journey. Many bore physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. Trauma, mistrust, and psychological wounds required decades of careful intervention, yet some, like Rebecca, eventually reclaimed a sense of autonomy and dignity. Their resilience became a testament to human strength, even after years of calculated cruelty. Legally, the Sullivan investigation spurred reforms across states, stricter oversight of orphanages and poorhouses, federal coordination for interstate crimes, and pioneering legislation against child trafficking. Socially, it prompted public reflection on community responsibility, the dangers of indifference, and the necessity of vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable. The case also demonstrated that systemic evil could only thrive under layers of deception, secrecy, and complacency. It underscored the need for transparency, accountability, and ethical oversight, not just in government, but in society as a whole. Closing reflection. The Sullivan farm may have been demolished, its basement sealed, but the lessons it left behind endure. Evil can wear a mask of normalcy, but courage, vigilance, and compassion remain powerful shields. By remembering the victims, acknowledging the horrors, and committing to protect those who cannot protect themselves, we honor both history and humanity. Share this story to keep the memory of the Sullivan case alive, reflect on the lessons it offers, and let it remind us all that even ordinary people, through acts of conscience and bravery, can illuminate the darkest corners of human history.